For over a century, France stood as a power above Africa, drawing wealth, dictating policy, and shaping destiny. But history, as it always does, has begun to turn. Across the continent, nations once silenced are finding their voices again. From Burkina Faso to Niger, from Mali to Gabon, Africa is no longer waiting for permission to rise. And as these nations reclaim their resources, their pride, and their future, the old empire in Paris begins to tremble. Tonight, we take a closer look at how France's long-standing dominance is crumbling under the weight of Africa's awakening, and what this shift means for the world we live in today. On the 9th of September 2025, the illusion of French stability shattered in front of the world. In the National Assembly, 194 voices called for support, but 354 rose in defiance. The budget, 44 billion euros in cuts, collapsed. And with it, the government of Prime Minister François Beu fell. This was not just parliamentary arithmetic. It was a reckoning. For years, Paris carried itself as the model of order, wagging its finger at Africa for supposed instability. Yet here was France itself, unable to hold a government steady for even a single season. Beu was the fifth prime minister in 2 years, a carousel of leaders, spinning in place, going nowhere. The collapse struck at the very heart of France's self-image, a nation that claimed to instruct others in democracy, now incapable of commanding confidence in its own chamber. And as the echoes of defeat filled Paris, another echo was rising, from the same Africa that France once tried to silence. Do not turn away. This is the story our ancestors longed to witness. Like, share, and subscribe, for Africa is not waiting to be taught anymore. Africa is teaching, and together we will make sure the world hears it. The 9th of September, 2025, was not just another date in France's political calendar. It was the day the Republic revealed its weakness to the world. Inside the National Assembly, Prime Minister François Beu faced the moment every leader dreads. His 44 billion euro austerity budget, cuts to pensions, healthcare, education, and state services, was put to the vote. 194 deputies stood with him. 354 stood against. The result was crushing, the symbolism devastating. France could no longer perform the most basic act of government, approving its own budget. Beu had warned of crisis if his plan failed. He argued that France's national debt, swollen to nearly 114% of GDP, was unsustainable. He pointed to the deficit, running at 5% of GDP, twice the European Union ceiling, and claimed credibility with Brussels and global markets was at stake. Without discipline, he insisted, France will lose its voice in Europe. But credibility cannot be demanded when trust has already been exhausted. The French people had lived through promises before. Each prime minister arrived pledging stability. Each left in failure. Macron had appointed 5 prime ministers since 2023. Beu was the 4th within a single year. A republic cannot preach order abroad while living on a carousel at home. And the carousel was not amusing anymore. It was nauseating. The budget was supposed to reassure. Instead, it provoked fury. Citizens already facing inflation near 6% and unemployment hovering above 7% were asked to accept frozen pensions and higher taxes. Nurses were told hospitals must tighten belts while wards overflowed. Teachers were told schools must do more with less while classrooms already struggled. The numbers may have satisfied Brussels, but they made no sense to families deciding whether to heat their homes or fill their fridges. The opposition seized the moment. Some condemned austerity as cruelty, others denounced it as hypocrisy. How could Macron ask the French worker to sacrifice for credibility in Brussels while spending billions maintaining the image of France as a global power? How could Paris justify defense deployments in the Sahel when it could not even defend living standards in Lyon or Marseille? The truth was unavoidable. Austerity had become punishment without purpose. The empire's promises of grandeur abroad no longer masked decline at home. For decades, Leaders insisted that sacrifices in Paris were necessary so France could lead in Africa. But by 2025, Africa had turned away. Mali expelled French troops in 2022. Burkina Faso followed in 2023. Chad ripped up its defense pact in 2024. Niger went further, expelling French diplomats and withdrawing from Francophonie in early 2025. Each humiliation was visible. Each made austerity harder to justify. So when Bieu pleaded for another round of sacrifices, the Assembly answered with finality, none. The defeat was not just parliamentary arithmetic. It was the collapse of a story the French state had told itself for generations. France was not the steady hand guiding others. France was a nation struggling to guide itself. The hypocrisy was glaring. When African leaders fell under pressure, French analysts declared their states unstable. When Paris itself toppled 5 prime ministers in 2 years, commentators in the Élysée called it democratic turnover. But the world could see through the euphemisms. France had become what it once accused Africa of being: fragile, unstable, unable to guarantee continuity. This is why Bieu's fall mattered. It was not the resignation of one man, but the exposure of a system stretched beyond repair. France, once the empire that carved borders in Africa, could not even draw a budget line at home. And the irony was sharper still. Just as Paris collapsed inside its own chamber, the capitals it once dominated were standing taller, making choices on their own terms. The Assembly had delivered its verdict. But the true reckoning was still to come, on the streets of France, and in the eyes of a world that no longer feared Paris's shadow. The fall of François Beux's government did not end with the gavel in the Assembly. It spilled into the streets, where the verdict of the people was even louder than the vote of deputies. Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Lille, cities long accustomed to strikes, now felt something deeper. This was not a routine protest over wages. It was the roar of a society refusing to be punished for a system collapsing under its own illusions. Within hours of the failed budget, transport unions announced stoppages that paralyzed the rail network. Metro lines slowed, buses were deserted, and commuters found themselves walking past walls of graffiti reading, "We pay, they play." Health workers gathered outside hospitals, warning that austerity would break services already stretched to the limit. Teachers marched with banners declaring, "No lessons from Paris until Paris learns its own." What united them was not ideology, but exhaustion. The police response was swift. Tear gas rolled through boulevards, riot shields advanced, and water cannons dispersed the crowds. But each dispersal was temporary. The next day, new marches appeared, larger than before. Demonstrations swelled into the hundreds of thousands. Families joined workers, retirees walked alongside students, and chants filled the air. Who governs France if not the people? The scale caught even seasoned observers off guard. Protest has always been part of French political life, but this was different. It felt less like negotiation and more like reckoning. The fall of the government had torn away the illusion that Paris was still in control. Now, ordinary citizens wanted accountability, not in speeches, not in slogans, but in policy that honored their dignity. Political leaders scrambled. Macron tried to present calm, calling the protests the noise of democracy. Yet his words rang hollow. To many, he sounded like a president describing a storm from the safety of a bunker. Opposition leaders were no better. They issued statements condemning austerity, but the people in the streets were not chanting for parties. They were chanting for survival. International media captured the scenes with a mix of shock and irony. British commentators noted that France, so quick to criticize instability abroad, was now living through it at home. German papers questioned whether Paris could still be trusted as a pillar of the European project. American outlets focused on the economic risk, pointing to investors pulling money from French bonds. In Moscow and Beijing, headlines were almost celebratory. France, the teacher of order, was now the student of chaos. But nowhere was the reaction sharper than in Africa. Across Bamako, Ouagadougou, Niamey, and N'Djamena, the images from Paris carried the flavor of poetic justice. For decades, Paris had labeled African protests as weakness. Now it was Paris that looked fragile. African commentators shared images of tear gas in Paris alongside archives of French troops firing gas in African capitals. The symmetry was too perfect to ignore. Leaders such as Assimi Goïta in Mali and Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso did not need to speak loudly. Their silence was already a statement. The people remembered how these leaders were mocked as reckless for challenging French authority. Yet in 2025, it was Paris itself stumbling, its streets filled with the very chaos it once claimed to control elsewhere. This was the emotional climax of the crisis. The hypocrisy France had hidden for so long was on full display. The republic that had long branded itself a beacon of order was now revealed as a state paralyzed by distrust. Distrust between citizens and leaders, between promises and reality, between the image of France and its condition on the ground. For the French worker, it was not just about numbers in a spreadsheet. It was about dignity denied. For the African observer, it was not just about Paris's humiliation. It was about history turning its wheel. Finally, the lecturer was being lectured by events. And yet the collapse in the streets was only the second act. Beyond protests and headlines, deeper consequences were waiting. Consequences that would reshape the machinery of state, the economy of households, and the fragile balance of French politics itself. If the Assembly's rejection exposed the fragility of France's leaders and the protests exposed the fury of its people, what would happen when those two forces collided with the realities of governance? The fall of François Bau's government was not only a parliamentary event. It carried consequences that reached into the daily lives of millions. The rejection of the budget left a void, and that void quickly spread into every corner of French society. Without an approved financial plan, ministries froze spending, local councils stalled projects, and social services braced for another year of uncertainty. The machinery of the state was not broken outright, but it was stuttering, and citizens felt the tremors. For pensioners, the collapse meant insecurity. They had already endured years of warnings about reforms that would delay retirement or trim benefits. Now, with the budget voided, their future felt less like a promise and more like a question mark. Retirees in Lyon spoke of cutting back on groceries. In Marseille, some turned to family for help covering rent. The numbers told the story. France spends nearly 14% of its GDP on pensions, one of the highest rates in the OECD. Without stability, even that social contract seemed vulnerable. For workers, the impact was just as sharp. Unemployment hovered around 7%, with youth joblessness closer to 16%. Inflation, which had eased slightly from its peak in 2023, was still stubbornly above 6%. Families already struggling with rising energy bills now faced the possibility of higher taxes. The idea of tightening belts once more felt like cruelty disguised as necessity. "We are not statistics," shouted one union leader during a rally in Paris. "We are lives, and we are tired of carrying the burden of fantasies written in palaces." In the political sphere, fragmentation deepened. The opposition smelled opportunity, but unity was absent. Left-wing parties demanded new elections, promising to reverse austerity. Right-wing groups called for stronger border policies, blaming migrants for economic strain. Centrist allies of Macron hesitated, torn between loyalty to the president and fear of voter backlash. What emerged was paralysis, a political class talking loudly while moving nowhere. This paralysis hurt France's credibility abroad. In Brussels, officials wondered aloud whether Paris could still be trusted to anchor the European Union's economic stability. In Berlin, comparisons were drawn to the late 1970s in Italy, when governments rose and fell so frequently that leadership itself became a revolving door. Investors noticed. Bond yields crept upward, signaling rising skepticism in markets that had once trusted France as a safe bet. The social consequences were subtler but more corrosive. Trust in institutions, already fragile, took another blow. Surveys showed that more than 60% of French citizens believed their government, any government, would not last a full term. A republic cannot thrive when cynicism becomes the national language. Without trust, even democratic rituals lose their power. Citizens begin to see elections not as opportunities but as interruptions in a cycle of failure. And yet the greatest irony was not in France's numbers but in its narratives. For decades, Paris had pointed to instability abroad, especially in Africa, as evidence of its own superiority. When African governments faced internal challenges, France offered lectures. But as its own crisis unfolded, French officials attempted to distract attention by highlighting supposed turmoil elsewhere. Stories circulated about unrest in Burkina Faso, including exaggerated reports tied to the so-called Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt. Yet such diversions convinced no one. The French public saw clearly. The problem was not in Ouagadougou or Bamako. It was in Paris itself. Within Africa, the reaction was telling. Citizens remembered how France had once dismissed their struggles as proof they were unfit for sovereignty. Now they watched the French Republic stumble under the same weight. Commentators in Mali observed that France's deficit was larger than the GDP of many African nations combined. Analysts in Burkina Faso noted that while Paris failed to pass a budget, Ouagadougou had successfully launched a gold refinery project. The contrast spoke volumes. For elders in the African diaspora, the crisis carried even deeper symbolism. They remembered colonial administrators who boasted of French superiority, who scolded Africans as unstable. Now, decades later, those same elders watched France grapple with fragility that could no longer be denied. History, one community leader in Dakar remarked, has a way of evening the scales. The immediate effect was paralysis, but the longer-term consequence was erosion. Erosion of faith in leaders. Erosion of the image of France as a reliable partner in Europe. Erosion of the myth that the Republic could demand sacrifices at home to justify relevance abroad. When that myth collapsed, only the pain remained. And as France's crisis deepened, its weakness echoed far beyond Europe, across the African continent, where new alliances were already reshaping the balance of power. France's domestic collapse was not a private affair. It was broadcast, dissected, and judged on the global stage. For decades, Paris had claimed to be a pillar of Europe and a power with global reach. Yet in September 2025, allies and rivals alike began to reassess whether France was still capable of carrying such weight. In Brussels, the tone was diplomatic but firm. European Union officials expressed concern over France's political paralysis. Behind the careful words lay a sharper reality. The EU's second-largest economy was now a liability. France's deficit, 5% of GDP, was double the bloc's official ceiling. Its debt, 114% of GDP, threatened the credibility of the Eurozone itself. German newspapers compared Paris to Rome in the early 2000s, when Italy's instability sent shockwaves across the continent. The question was whispered but unavoidable. Could the European project still depend on France as one of its anchors? Washington viewed the crisis through a different lens. The United States values France as a NATO partner and as a diplomatic voice within Europe. But American analysts also recognized opportunity. With France distracted at home and retreating abroad, Washington had space to strengthen its own presence in West Africa through security training and development initiatives. What Paris presented as redeployment, Washington saw as vacancy, and vacancies invite competition. Moscow and Beijing responded with open calculation. Russia, already cultivating ties with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, framed France's crisis as proof that Western promises were hollow. Its state media gleefully broadcast images of protests in Paris alongside commentary about African nations taking their future into their own hands. China, meanwhile, emphasized stability. Beijing quietly expanded infrastructure agreements with African governments, positioning itself as the partner who delivers projects rather than lectures. Africa itself did not stay silent. The African Union issued measured statements about sovereignty, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Leaders who had once endured Paris's pressure now found themselves courted by new partners. ECOWAS debates shifted tone. No longer were they centered on external approval, but on how to build regional capacity free from dependency. Across the Sahel, the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States demonstrated that the absence of France did not create a vacuum. It created an opening. Global media amplified the irony. For years, Paris had insisted that Africa's instability justified France's presence. Now the headlines told another story. France, unstable at home, unable to lead abroad. The teacher had lost credibility in the classroom, and the students were writing their own syllabus. The reputational damage was severe. France could no longer present itself as the steady hand of Europe or as the indispensable ally of Africa. Its allies recalibrated, its rivals advanced, and Africa itself turned the page. With Paris diminished on the world stage, the question grew sharper. What choices would Africa make with its newfound space? And could this moment mark the birth of a different future for the continent? With France weakened at home and sidelined abroad, the spotlight shifted firmly onto Africa. For decades, the continent was spoken of as dependent, unable to move without direction from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. Yet in 2025, the question was no longer whether Africa could stand, but how Africa would choose to walk its own path. The evidence of change was already visible. In Burkina Faso, a new gold refinery came online, producing hundreds of kilograms daily and signaling a determination to keep wealth within national borders. In Niger, the decision to withdraw from Francophonie was more than symbolic. It was a declaration that language and identity would serve sovereignty, not the other way around. Mali deepened cooperation with regional partners, insisting that its security challenges be met on its own terms, not scripted in European capitals. These were not gestures of defiance. They were steps in a deliberate project of independence. The departure of France did not leave emptiness. It left space. Into that space came new actors. Russia with its security advisors, China with its infrastructure financing, Turkey with its trade missions. But more importantly, into that space stepped Africa itself. Regional blocs like the Alliance of Sahel States began coordinating military, political, and economic strategies without waiting for Parisian approval. ECOWAS, despite its divisions, continued to debate integration and industrialization from an African perspective rather than a European one. The African Union amplified its calls for value-added industries, urging nations not just to export resources, but to process them at home. This turning point was also about leadership. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso emerged as symbols of a new generation. Western media often reduced him to headlines such as Ibrahim Traoré coup, framing his rise as disorder. But across the Sahel, he represented something different. Refusal to bow, refusal to recycle the old compromises that left Africa poor under the guise of partnership. For young Africans, he embodied the belief that sovereignty must be more than a slogan. It must be practiced, even under pressure. The road ahead, however, is not without risks. New partnerships bring opportunities, but they can also mask new dependencies. Infrastructure loans can strengthen economies or trap them in debt. Security alliances can protect borders or entangle nations in foreign rivalries. The challenge for Africa is not simply to replace France with another power, but to build institutions strong enough to protect sovereignty from all directions. Still, there is a sense of hope that outweighs the risks. For elders in the diaspora, the current moment feels like a turning of history's wheel. They remember the decades when Africa's future was decided in Paris or London. Today, decisions are being taken in Bamako, Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Accra. That shift alone is revolutionary. And so the story circles back to the larger stage. If France is shrinking and Africa is rising, what does this mean for the future of both? The answer lies not only in politics but in identity, a future that we will confront in the final chapter. The fall of François Bau's government was more than a French crisis. It was a turning point in the long story between Europe and Africa. For generations, France justified its authority by claiming to be the model of stability while portraying Africa as unstable, fragile, and dependent. But in September 2025, that narrative collapsed. France could not pass a budget. France could not hold a prime minister. And France could no longer convince the world that its hand was steady. Meanwhile, Africa was doing something Paris never expected. It was rising. The gold refinery in Burkina Faso, Niger's bold withdrawal from Francophonie, Mali's deepening of regional ties, all these steps signaled that the continent was no longer asking permission. Leaders once reduced to headlines like the Ibrahim Traoré coup were reframing Africa's story from within. It was no longer about how France defined them, but how they defined themselves. Even the attempts to distract could not erase this truth. Rumors and reports about the Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt appeared in Western outlets, often presented as proof of instability. Yet such stories convinced fewer and fewer people. Africans and members of the diaspora recognized them for what they were, old tools of narrative control. The same phrase, Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt, was repeated to suggest weakness, but in reality it revealed fear. The fear that a continent long subdued was finally stepping into power. For elders across the diaspora, this is a vindication of memory. They remember the pain of colonial extraction, the humiliation of dependency, the arrogance of foreign lectures. To see Paris stumble while Africa builds is to witness history correcting itself. And for younger generations, it is an invitation to continue building institutions, industries, and movements strong enough to protect sovereignty not just from one empire, but from any who would try to replace it. If this story speaks to your spirit, do not let it end here. Like this video so our voices travel further. Share it so others see what mainstream headlines hide. And subscribe, because our future will not be written in silence. It will be spoken aloud by us, together. In the comments, write the words that carry this season forward. Africa rise, new Africa, it's time for Africa. Let the world hear the chorus, because history is not only turning, it is turning in our favor.